Howdy, y'all. Welcome to the Kentuckian. Today we're going to be talking about the military and some of the recent political issues that have infected the military. I mean, the military's had it pretty rough over the last few years, what with the forced injections that the different soldiers have had to deal with, the transgendered soldiers, and some of the issues with homosexual soldiers that have happened over the last decade or two, the pathetic woke ads about Emma and her two moms and so on, having very little to do with the military and talking more about modern political issues, the drag queen recruiting mascots that have been coming out recently, at least with the Navy. All this to say the military has become increasingly woke. And there's some sinister threads. There is a threads of a plan or a plot, if you want to use that term, that I'm going to briefly go over today and explain why the military is being targeted, how it's been targeted, and it's something I think will be very helpful for you and something we need to be very aware of. If you like what you see with the Kentucky, why don't you hit that subscribe button, try and get us to our goal of 1,000 subscribers. That's what I'm shooting for, so hopefully y'all can help me get there and stay up with the new content that the Kentuckian comes out with. The first point that I want to talk about, talking about how the military has been made or pushed to be more woke, is perhaps the least sinister one, if you want to use that term. As with virtually any kind of social or cultural issue, there is a reflection of the culture of the time in the military. You think about the transgender, the homosexual policy woes, a lot of the don't ask, don't tell stuff that was from a few years back, and then now very recently a lot of discussions on how do you deal with transgenders. Do you pay for surgeries? What kind of assistance do you provide? Do they even have a place? Even the question with homosexuals has been, do they even have a place in the military? There's a lot of logistical issues, even just from a practical standpoint, that come up. You think about the lowering of fitness standards that has become increasingly common, usually the stated reason being so that women aren't left out. That includes the special forces and so on. A lot of this is a mirror of what's going on today, the kind of issues you think about, how that affects the workplace, how that affects government issues and discussions that are going on, both federal and state, and I guess local to a degree as well. You think about how many people have had to deal with this sort of thing, especially when you think about the big corporations, but businesses in general and attempts of the government to regulate that sort of thing. It's a reflection of what is happening today, and that certainly is a factor. We need to recognize or realize that with the concerted effort to fundamentally change America into a socialist, tyrannical, post-truth dystopian nightmare, because, and you might ask, why would that even happen? Don't forget that there's people at the top that are there to gain from it, right? People throughout history have always wanted to gather power and influence for themselves. Greed and covetousness and selfishness have fueled many of those things, and America is no exception to those sorts of corrupting influences. But there's a concerted effort to push America in that way, and it makes sense that to one degree or another, that will be reflected in the military. However, there's a lot more to it with the military, and a big part of it is the unique environment that the military provides when it comes to political agendas and social engineering and that sort of thing. The structured nature of the military means that many political moves can be pushed from the top down, and nothing or little is done to stop it or slow it. As you're part of the military, it being different from really any civilian organization, you're there to follow orders. Your job is to follow orders, right? Unless you're at the very top, everybody's following orders from somebody. You can't just quit if you don't like the way things go. When you're enlisted for a term of service, you cannot just leave. Even getting out of the military in those situations can often have severe repercussions. If you're dishonorably discharged, you lose a huge number of your rights. There's very far-reaching consequences, or at least a significant one. I say a huge number, perhaps one of the more important, which is the right to keep and bear arms. If you're dishonorably discharged, that's a huge thing that can hurt your ability to get jobs. It can have a lot of effects on your future if you were to be dishonorably discharged from the military, and you can't just leave. You're under a different set of laws. People oftentimes forget that. Military law is different from civilian law. And while it's not, so far removed that it would be totally unrecognizable, it is significantly different. It's stricter in some ways. There's things that you can do to, say, protest or to try and stop a certain political agenda in the civilian world that could get you in a lot of trouble in the military world. there's so many things like that. Again, you can't just leave. And even if what the issue you're talking about might not result in a dishonorable discharge, you've still got to stay to that end of that enlistment term. And that might mean 3 or 4 years of being miserable, being oppressed by officers or non-commissioned officers or other staff of the military because you made a decision that they didn't like, or you made a stand or said something that they didn't like. It is a very different environment, and conformity for a reason is very much emphasized, we'll say. And it's important in a lot of ways, but it allows, if people are to push a political or social engineering agenda through the military, it provides a fertile environment for that to go basically unopposed. You basically form a really, really strong form of groupthink where you do not question the status quo. There's a lot of incentives not to question the status quo, not to rock the boat. And there's a lot of incentives to conform, right? So it's kind of that bait and switch. There's reasons you want to do both, on the negative and the positive side, I should say. So that, again, that can creates an environment that is ripe for any kind of political agenda. The nature of the environment, the nature of the military, creates an environment, sort of a micro environment to push or to test or to study political agendas, not only with little pushback, but also with little oversight. You think about the military and the way it exists. Even though it is technically governed by the military or by the government, in general, it is extremely isolated from the rest of the government. And what that leaves is a situation where you have all sorts of different units in the military, all sorts of different groups in the military, and they can kind of do what they want on a day-to-day basis. This is not to say there's absolutely no accountability, but most of that accountability comes from within the military itself. And if you have people in the higher up positions that are either going to look over that or push some sort of woke agenda, some sort of political agenda, then a lot of that oversight is, one, either pointless, or it actually pushes the very thing that we should be the most concerned about. It's really not an all bad situation, because when the government micromanages things, it usually doesn't go well. That's no secret to us. But at the same time, if you're able to control that enough, if people in positions of power are able to influence that enough, and that's what power gives you the ability to do to one degree or another, then you can use it for social engineering. You can use it as a test bed on people to see how they react, to see what they will and won't do, and so on. There's sort of a culture in the military where you do what needs to be done, and you may kind of look over some of the regulations sometimes. And while that can be good at times, I suppose, it can also be manipulated and used for evil purposes, like we're talking about. There's actually been cases of military officers doing some really messed up stuff to, say, the lower enlisted or that sort of thing. And the officer responsible, whether it was a harassment of some kind, or whether it was a really poor leadership, or kind of going after their own men or that sort of thing, they basically got a slap on the hand, a reprimand, and then maybe even they retire with awards and full pension like nothing ever happened. There's sort of a circle the wagon and defend your own philosophy or culture, and that's a big problem. And that leads us into the next part, which is talking about the officer corps itself, because the officer corps, the commissioned officer corps, the people that are in the most direct charge of the military, in general, the officer corps is very corrupt. And let me say, too, that what I'm about to say and what I've been saying, it's not to say that everybody in the military goes along with it. It's trying to discuss the environment that exists and to be frank and to be real about it. And also that because of the way the military is structured, it may depend, how bad this is may depend to a certain degree on what unit you're in, right? Every unit, whether it's an infantry battalion or some kind of office where they do administrative work, everyone is going to have its own independence to a certain degree. And so that may affect how bad this woke infection is. It's there all the time. You think about it, at the end of the day, they still report to some higher up, and they report to some higher up, and they report to somebody in the government, right? Technically the president, but realistically there's a lot of people that have their hands in it. So it does depend. This is a general trend, not an absolute for every single situation, of course. But along with that, the officer corps is in general very corrupt. Think about it. To be a commissioned officer in the U.S. military, with little exception, if you're in peacetime like we are right now, you have to have a college degree, and generally a 4-year bachelor's degree. And right now, today in peacetime, most commissioned officers join the military right out of college. They either go to one of the academies or they go to college. Maybe they're in the ROTC program, and they do that for 4 years. And then basically, as soon as they get out, they join the military. They go to officer candidate school, or I believe it goes under a different name now, but basically the boot camp for officers, if you want to think of it that way. And they go straight into being an officer. Well, what does that mean? That means that you have people that are in positions of leadership in the military, that are the ones in charge, the officer corps, and they're coming into this position with very little real world experience. They've been in college, and let's be honest, I've graduated college relatively recently. It is not like the real world in many, many ways. And they haven't had the opportunity to get real world practical experience. They live in sort of I don't even know if idealistic is the right word, but sort of the microcosm or odd college culture mindset that really is kind of this detached from reality mindset. They haven't had the opportunity to get out into the real world from a perspective of they've been brainwashed, bombarded with liberal or woke propaganda for the last 4 years in almost every case. And then usually people get out of college and they're able to get into the real world, and a lot of people sort of become less liberal. They become less woke because reality slaps them in the face, right? Because most of the stuff is extremely unrealistic. But if you're an officer right out of college, you don't have the opportunity to get that perspective on real life. And then you're going from that state and you're going into a very structured, rigid situation that we've already talked about fosters conformance above all else, and that conformity above all else, and that sort of thing. And it's corrupt. And it's a very structured tradition or habit-based, if you want to use the word, officer corps, where there's a certain way of doing things and you don't question that. It's just as powerful in the officer corps, probably more powerful in the officer corps. And so if that understanding is woke, if that culture is woke, well, you've created a hotbed of people that are out of touch with reality, that are willing to push their propagandized woke views, and they're in an environment where that's encouraged or outright demanded. And then you take into account that even people that maybe were patriotic or wanted to serve their country are also going into the officer corps with people that are going into the military strictly to help a political career or for some political reason like that. And they're just interested in what they can get out of it, right? And so now you have people that are looking for whatever they can get out of it, that aren't worried about morals or ethics or right or wrong, and they can just, take hold of the corruption and the structure of the military that sort of tends toward or creates a fertile environment for corruption, and go with it. And that's the environment that these young people that are becoming officers, becoming the ones in charge of the military, are coming right into. And it's a very dangerous situation that creates a generally, again, not without exception, of course, but a relatively or fairly corrupt officer corps. And now you can push those woke agendas. And that's what these people are being indoctrinated to do in every aspect of life. And when they're in the military, when they commission, they have an opportunity to do it. And the final main point is that not really what is happening, but why it's happening, more or less. And the result of it, or the point of it, is to purge the military. The U.S. military is a volunteer organization for most of its history, and so it has almost always relied on the vigilance and the patriotism of the American people. And even though over the last few decades it has shifted to focus more on the things that you can get out of it, right? And focusing more perhaps on the more vulnerable in our society, offering, this is my way out of I don't know, the inner city or a poor area that you grew up in. This is my way to pay for college. This is my way to, get something out of it. And certainly it shifted more that way. But at the same time, still the majority of the people in the military are generally relatively patriotic, relatively conservative, normal Americans. the very nature of what the military is attracts a certain kind of person, or at least the very nature of how it's perceived attracts a certain kind of person. That's why so many times the military ads focused on, the vehicles and explosions and all the cool looking uniforms and the discipline and the camaraderie and all those sorts of things. You think about recruiting ads now and you see how they're trying to change the perception of the military. All that to say, generally, people in the military are pretty solid people. And there's other issues there, but I think you all see what I'm getting at. You think about what the military represents on a governmental standpoint. The military represents a large portion of the practical power of the federal government. There's a reason that the founding fathers were very opposed, in fact, in many cases, vehemently opposed to a federal standing military or one of any size at all. Perhaps there could be a very small professional one. Because if a government wants to tyrannize or control people, the military is the most practical extension of their power. If they don't have a military, it is very difficult to tyrannize people. You think about what that is, and you think about people being in charge that want to garner more power, that want to use tyranny to enrich themselves with power, with influence, with money, and so on. And you understand why it's important to control who's in the military, who is willing to go to what extreme, right? And that's why an environment that is increasingly hostile to quote-unquote normal Americans has been created in the military to drive the current members away, to hopefully prevent those people from enlisting in the first place for the new ones, and if they do enlist, to create an environment that is so toxic and so hostile to normal, relatively American patriotic moral values that they basically, at the very least, if they're not absolutely crushed, just keep their head down and get out of there as soon as possible. And with that, you can create a structure that would not oppose you and actually will go along with your twisted ideas of power and tyranny. And that's really one of the big points of what's happening to the military. It's practical, right? We talk about theoretical stuff and laws and regulations and all sorts of stuff all the time. But at the end of the day, you have to have a practical application of your power. You have to have an enforcer. And that's what the military can be in the wrong hands, and that's what they're trying to create. At the very least, a force that won't oppose them, and hopefully a force that will support them. Now, when you get people that believe in using force to enforce their will, whether it's to take guns away or whatever other social agenda, and you get those people in the military, that's dangerous because they have no morals guiding what they support or what they don't support, and they'll do horrible things to promote what they want. We even have situations of people in the military, higher ups in the military, where one of them will say that they don't even know what the term woke means when people ask about the military becoming more woke. And then you'll have another one talk about wanting to understand their white privilege and just this gaslighting of, no, there's nothing going on in the military, while they're actively pushing it on the public that there is an obvious trend in the military towards woke leftist politics. It has backfired from one degree to another. I understand people say, well, they weaken the military. And it's true. They do weaken the military because you get weaker people. Recruiting numbers have been extremely low, and they've been doing some crazy things to try and bring them up. But at the same time, you still get people in there that are willing to do anything, horrible things, to justify their political beliefs. And that is something we need to be aware of, but hopefully it gives you some idea of what's going on in the military and why it's something we need to really be aware of. But anyway, I hope that you found this to be an interesting episode, and remember all the social media that we have. Don't forget about the merchandise shop for the Kentuckian as well. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we'll make a real difference in this whole world. Been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.